Very pleased to have you here tonight and very pleased to be doing the fourth in our series of vocational reflections. And Ann Silvers-Lee is our speaker this evening. You read a little bit about her in the publicity. But as introduction, Ann notes that she was born in Des Moines, Iowa, lived and worked on both the East and West coasts before moving to Philadelphia in 1993, where she and Wynn have lived in various spots, but Mount Airy, actually it was East and West Mount Airy, right?
Yeah.
So, and then joined Northwest Village in 2012. So, Ann, it's a delight to have you.
Okay.
And we look forward to hearing about your vocational life and the librarian.
Okay, yes. I look so demure, don't I? Marion the librarian, who was even from Mason City, Iowa, not Des Moines, I hasten to say. So, so thank you, Susan. You know, this is a little daunting. I find it always kind of hard to talk about myself. I'm used to instead asking people questions, asking, where are you from and how did you get to where you are? So I really like to find out where people were, how their journey, and then ways that our lives intersect. And because I want to make sure to honor the time commitment and not go off on tangents. If I look down, it's because I'm just checking a couple of notes to keep myself on track and not get distracted. So to be following Hope and Sarah and Lawrence, you know, really, as they say, no pressure. So laugh out loud. We can just all get that out. But here goes. Let me start out by telling you a little bit about myself and how I came to be a librarian and what that life has been like for me. As Susan said, I was born in Des Moines. So I was a city girl in what's still primarily a rural state. I went to McAllister College in St. Paul, where Wynn and I met. He was teaching in the French department, but I hasten to say that he was never my teacher, at least in the classroom. I've certainly learned a lot from him in other ways. I considered teaching French because I was a French major, because at that time, really, what else did people do with a French major? I think we know there are many more ways now, but I got as far as becoming a student teacher, and it was pretty clear to me. I thought, you know, this is just not going to work. I am not going to be happy being here. I know some of you are teachers and have done that very well, but that just wasn't going to work for me. So I went to library school at the University of Minnesota, and that's where I got my master's degree. And that's been a much better fit. As Susan said, we've lived in several different states during the last 50 years. You know, St. Paul, the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. We lived in Hartford, Nantucket, San Diego, and now for the last 30 years here in Philadelphia. And in thinking back about all the places that we've lived on both coasts and, you know, Southern and so on, you know, I'm really almost kind of sorry that we didn't live in more places, because it's just such a great learning opportunity when you live in a different location. I was what the insurance companies call a trailing spouse, which now just seems like such a funny expression. But that's what they call me, because I was the one trailing along, following Wynn because of Wynn's different job opportunities. So how and why I became a librarian, it wasn't just because I didn't want to be a teacher. I mean, this, you know, I did in some ways kind of fall into it, but libraries, reading, and information were really important in my family when I think back on that. My father's favorite place in his small Iowa hometown was the public library. And it was the Kendall Young Library. It was just a lovely, lovely building. It was a place of refuge for him. and along with a way for him to start being an armchair traveler, which he really was all his life. So he read about France before he went there during World War II, many years before he went there. And as that war was ending, that's where he met my mother in the Paris metro. My mother was French. She spoke English and she was working for the Signal Corps. And so she apparently had a name tag on that said, "I speak English." And so my dad, who never, ever got lost, ever, decided he didn't know where he was going and struck up a conversation. So they could never agree later on which metro stop all this was happening in. But I've always loved that story. It just matched them to a T. For a short time after they married, my parents lived in Webster City, which was my dad's hometown. And my mother then worked at that library, the Kendall Young Library. She spoke so fondly of the librarians who welcomed her, and they were very unjudgmental. I think it was really hard for her living there, as apparently people were not too welcoming because she was someone from another country who claimed one of their boys. My dad was really good looking, so I'm sure there were a few young ladies who were like, "What?" And when my sister and I were growing up, regular trips to the library were just part of our family routine, and we were always giving each other books and records just all the time. And then in college at Macalester, freshmen were at that time assigned to a faculty mentor, not an advisor, but a mentor. And I was lucky enough to be assigned to Jim Hawley, who was the college librarian at the time. He seemed like such a Renaissance man. He just seemed to know so much. And I really wanted to be like him. And I think at the time it was harder for women, for me anyway, to imagine doing something other than teaching or nursing. I understand better now the importance of role models. We hear about that all the time. And I really get it now. I don't think I understood it then. But the librarians I knew seemed like such smart people. So that undoubtedly helped impact the direction that I went. So in terms of my career, I was a librarian for most of my working life. And because we lived in several states and I worked all the time, I had the chance to work in a number of different libraries, from very small to very large. Public libraries, state libraries, institutional libraries, primarily prison libraries. And I also worked for a time as a planning associate for the county regional planning office when we were in Virginia. Probably the most unexpected part of my career was working in the men's prison library in Connecticut, in Enfield, Connecticut. We had just moved to Hartford, and I was weighing a couple of different job opportunities, being the director of a smaller public library or starting a library program at this men's prison. So you know what I chose. The chance to do something different was just really appealing. The Enfield prison already had a library, of course, because that's really mandated, but it was a bit haphazard. So I set up programs and I worked to get a collection that was all about the guys there. Many of them had never been out of their hometown. And keep in mind, Connecticut's a really small state. But if you had asked them to point out, well, where's Enfield on this map? Or, show us where your city's from. Where's Bridgeport on this map? They would not have had a clue. So, the whole notion of geographic isolation was something I learned early on. But when I was working at Enfield, I really had a chance to learn about different publishers and authors who wrote about Black people, or for adults who were what they called then adult new readers. They hadn't finished high school. Maybe they were working on their GED, but maybe their English reading skills were maybe at a 4th grade reading level, or maybe they were Spanish speaking. And those kinds of collection opportunities were something that was, really just being discussed at that point among public libraries. The most popular programs we held there were the poetry writing classes that I started. The guys had time, and you need time to write poetry because you really need to be able to distill those thoughts you might have into just a few words. It was a really rewarding job, and while there were some of those folks, I will admit, I would not have cared to meet them in a dark alley. There were others that were just, they'd been dealt a bad hand, or maybe they didn't have the family support that I was lucky enough to have. My last gig was with the Free Library of Philadelphia, and that's where I met Mary Flournoy, who I think is also still on this Zoom. I first worked with the library director at that time, Elliot Shellcrott, whom some of you may have known. And then I moved to a planning spot. And then my last assignment was heading up a new division, the materials management division. This involved a lot of change management because we were merging what had been two very separate divisions. Mary will remember what I'm talking about. And they each did things their own way. We made a lot of changes in how materials were bought, what we bought, and just how we went about choosing them, that whole process. And we learned a lot together. So as a librarian, I think a lot of people think, well, reference or a children's librarian, and I never really was either of those. I focus primarily on the materials, not just books, but all formats. But along with that, the management and the planning, how to help people, how to bring people together and plan something and then get it done. With the exception of what I have to say was the nearly constant problem of not enough money. It was a lot of fun. It was challenging, but it was really rewarding.
We had a bit of a preview for this talk today, and when I heard a bit of Anne's background, I was struck with how she stuck with being a librarian her whole career. It must have been a good choice for you, and I'm interested in you have any reflections on why it was a good choice
Sure.
for you.
Well, I would absolutely continue to counsel a younger person, as I often have, to consider libraries for his or her career. Yes, it's changed so much. And, that expression of it's not your mom's library is certainly true. But I think that's really one of the good things and one of the exciting things about that as a career path. It is changing, and there are many opportunities to continue working closely with people and helping them. I used to hear, and I'm sure people are still saying it, who needs libraries? After all, doesn't everybody have the internet? There's Wikipedia. Well, yes, and yes. But on the other hand, I think libraries are more important now than ever. And certainly here in Philadelphia, and it grieves me that there are all the budget issues affecting the free library. People continue to need access to reliable and accurate information, especially now, and they need free access. And that's really what libraries and librarians are all about, in my experience. When I was working, and Mary will probably remember this, we used to say that about half of the Philadelphia population did not have access to the internet. They did not have free access. And sadly, I think there are still many people who don't have reliable access to the internet in their homes. And we know how much we depend on that. You cannot apply for a job without access to the internet and so on. So where do they go? They go to the library. And it's considered the safe place, maybe in some times the only safe place in their neighborhoods. And as for me and why I think it was a good fit, well, I love problem solving. I love connecting people with information. My first job after graduate school was with the public library development arm of the Minnesota State Library. And so early on, I connected really with public libraries in that working capacity, because I could really see they were there for everyone. It wasn't just for me, it was for everybody. And as I said earlier, I helped to start and support libraries in prisons, which were essentially like small public libraries. And boy, did those people really need good information. Even today, when I am on the train, I see somebody reading, I'm kind of like trying to peer over their shoulder, or like that. And sometimes I'll just, out and out ask, so what are you reading? And when we travel, it's not uncommon, as Wynn knows, to have us visit the public library, which we did when we were in Egypt, in fact, in December. So that's just an occupational hazard. I loved what I did, and I had the great experience of working with so many different libraries. When I was in a smaller library, it was just so much fun to have those one-on-one moments when someone would tell me how much they'd enjoyed reading something I'd recommended. When we were in the Shenandoah Valley, I was managing that materials function. And my office was right next to where the circulation desk was. And at the time, one woman that I remember was an older woman who I realize now is probably my age. She would come in every week for a recommendation. And then I would hear about what she thought about what I had set her off with. And sometimes she would say, Mrs. Horgan would say, I just did not like that, Ann. But then she'd also say, but I understand why you recommended it to me. So when I was at the free library, it was harder to have those moments. But with my staff, we spent a lot of time looking at use statistics. And when people would say, well, what does statistics have to do with being a librarian? And I would say, but they tell a story, and we know how to tell stories. So we would look at things like how many holds did a book title have? And what did that mean in terms of how many copies that we should have? What was going to be a bestseller? What world languages did we need to have? Who was moving into Philadelphia and where? So for instance, there was a period of time when we were starting to see people from Bhutan move to South Philadelphia. And then it was like, oh my goodness, what kinds of materials can we get that are in the Bhutanese language? And where can we get those? So sadly, there are many challenges still to overcome in libraries. Staff hiring here is a big issue. That's why before you go to your library, you should probably call to say, are you open today? And then the other sad issue right now that we keep reading about are all the current challenges to book titles in public libraries and school libraries. So hopefully that pendulum's going to shift again. Hopefully.
Anne, I have also enjoyed hearing about your retirement. In fact, I met you just about the time that you were retiring. Tell us a bit about that. Did you plan your retirement? Did it just pop up in front of you and you picked some flowers, or how did that happen?
Well, you've already heard I'm a planner, so no, they didn't just happen. But I can really look at my parents as great role models for us, because when they were getting ready to retire, they thought about where they wanted to live and what they wanted to do. My dad had always been interested in politics. So when they moved to their small town in the foothills of the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas, he ran for office. He ran for what would be the equivalent, say, in Montgomery County, of a county commissioner, and he got elected. And my mother volunteered at her local library. At that time, it was strictly run by volunteers, but she really helped maneuver them into a bigger space and set them up for being able to hire paid staff. So they both really did so much in their retirement. I was just so proud of them. So when Wynn and I started to think about retirement, we knew we had to plan ahead. We agreed we wanted to downsize and we wanted to stay in Philadelphia. We've lived in some other great places, but we really, really like it here. There's so much to do. A lot of it's so affordable or even free. So we started looking for a different house or a different place to live about 5 years before we retired. And then Wynn spotted our house about a mile from our much bigger house in East Mount Airy. And so case closed. So that was about 9 years ago when we moved from a large house with 3 stories and an enormous backyard to our much smaller house. And we love our close-knit neighborhood. And of course, we know Steve and Lucy that way. But kudos to NVN, which really helped shape our retirement. As Susan said, Lynn and I got involved with what was then called Mutual Mount Airy, just as it was being formed. And Lynn and I were both still working. But much as I enjoyed the people that I was working with, I could see we were going to need to set up a different social network. And we read about this village idea and went to a couple of meetings that Anne and Peter Jeffsikas had organized. And then they pulled us on to the board pretty early on. So I served on the NVN board for about 8 years, and then for treasurer for 4 of those years. So, and I have to give a plug to a couple of the interest groups that I've been involved with, because the interest groups have just been such a great way to meet other members and learn new things. So the gardening group, for instance, that Nettie Scott, who's now on the board, organized, maybe 3 years ago, Susan, because Susan and I are both on that same group. And we were talking before we started about what's popping up in our garden now. And it just gives me such joy to see things that I know I got from Hope.
Mhm.
The phlox is doing really well, thank you. Or from Nettie, or from Yolanda, from others. So that's just been great. And then the monthly film group, which Joan Farnsworth started in 2013. And some of you will remember Joan. She moved to California several years ago. And Faye Ross has kept that group going on. I love that we don't always agree. In fact, one could say we often don't agree. But that's really the fun of it. My current big involvement is being a board member for Network for New Music, which is a small music organization that commissions, we perform, and then we promote and champion new music, and new music in a more the classical sense, and as opposed to, say, folk or world music. And I now chair their board of directors. It's a little daunting, this being the fundraising climate that we find ourselves in. And how I got into that is, I've always enjoyed all kinds of music. But somewhere maybe 20 years ago, as we were going to concerts, I realized that the things I was responding to the most were new pieces, things I'd never heard before. And so it was always this just big surprise, because honestly, you didn't know what you were going to hear. So I've really gravitated toward that. It doesn't mean that I love everything I hear the first time, and sometimes it takes me several times, but that's just been a great pleasure. And a big news flash, because Network has commissioned a new work from a composer named Vivian Fung, who's starting to get to be well known, and it'll be performed next spring. And the reason I'm telling you about that is that this was Wynn's gift to me for our 50th wedding anniversary. So we're commissioning it, and we're doing it through Network. Once I know the exact date, I'll be sure to tell everybody. All I know right now is that she's doing a piece that is apparently going to be for 2 pianos and 2 percussionists. I also volunteer for Friends of the Wissahickon. I applied to be a trail ambassador several years ago because I love to hike in the park, as Steve does. And I thought it would be a great way to learn more about this great resource. So I've made some wonderful new friends and learned a lot, and also helped do my part for keeping the park clean, because during the pandemic, as you can imagine, that our park has just been loved to death. And the kinds of things people leave behind are just, gobsmacking. And of course, one big benefit of being retired is that I no longer have to confine any travel to a 2-week vacation period. So pre-pandemic, Wynn and I have gotten to, visit a lot of really wonderful places around the world. But we were in Egypt and Jordan in December, so, and we did okay. So we look forward to, to other such travel opportunities. I guess just in closing, I would say, and maybe some of you have heard this too. People will say, I don't know what to do in retirement. It scares me. And frankly, I'm always a little mystified by that, because being retired has, allowed me to spend more time on and with different organizations, things that I care about. And it's been a way to learn new things and to meet new people, just as I've met all of you that I never would have met had it not been through NVN. And of course, then to give back to the community. So that's our time to do that. So I feel so lucky to be in this retirement chapter. I'm lucky. I'm going to knock on wood on Susan's lovely table here, because so far I've been healthy, as is Wynn. And so it's been all good. So thank you, Susan, for our conversation tonight. And I look forward to hearing from Clara the next time out. And I understand Steve will be conversing with Susan later on. So I look forward to hearing those. So thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Wonderful. Folks, unmute yourself when you can. Anne is going to take questions. That was so thorough and wonderfully descriptive. I'm not sure we have questions because anything was vague, but there may be things that you would like to point out or hear more about.
And this is Claire.
Hi, Claire.
Just because you sort of introduced me as coming next. My mother loved the library and would drag me there all the time. And she was a school teacher, which you'll learn about later, but she was always stealing books from the school library, and I was so upset with her. But
hopefully she returned them after they were being well used.
well used, yes. But yes, the library was a big part of my life, and thank you for being a part of that.
Okay. I'm sorry. I think Steve Stroman had a question.
I do have a question. And are there any issues today in the library universe that have really pushed you to get sort of re-involved or involved to some degree?
Well, I've thought about that, and certainly some of my former coworkers, are volunteering for their libraries. I've just chosen to go in other directions. As I said, I was never a children's librarian or a reference librarian. So say helping out at Houston School probably wouldn't be, wouldn't be a natural fit for me. Although I, love reading, and I love to read to kids and have them read to me. But my time has been filled up with these other things that I never had time to do before. So we all have a limited amount of time, and we have to figure out how we're gonna splice and dice it. So that's the choice that I've personally made.
Hope,
Unmute.
you're muted.
Or you could put your question in chat.
No.
Oh, okay.
Maria.
Wanted to echo Claire in a way. My first memory
And
anywhere I was allowed to go.
this is Mary, and I've never done this on my phone before,
Oh.
but when you were talking about when you took over as head of materials management, I think that was when ebooks really came to the fore.
Yeah.
And certainly during the pandemic, ebooks saved many people's lives.
They did.
Can you talk a little bit about how the library fought and is buying ebooks?
Well, that's still happening. I know I've become a big ebook reader myself. So yeah, it complicated our budget situation, but I could see when I would be going to conferences and I'd start hearing about ebooks, and I said, we got to start doing this. There were books come in many different formats. There's, print, then there's large print, and there are paperback versions. There are books on tape. There were books on CD. Then there were ebooks, but not just one kind of ebook. Initially, there were multiple formats of ebook, and it was a huge budget issue, to say nothing of a learning opportunity, as a former boss used to describe it. So, so we had to, try to just see where our readers were taking us and what formats they were asking for. But yeah, we started doing that. Let's see, I've been retired for 7 years now. I'm guessing it's been close to 15 years now. And to Mary's point, yes, I think ebooks were, what most public libraries across the country, had to be closed during the pandemic. And I'm sure that their users, as our users here, did, started relying on ebooks. Maybe they were buying them, but they're expensive. The issue for public libraries with ebooks is they're very expensive. It's not just your downloadable Audible thing for 99 cents. I don't know what the going rate now is, but publishers are expecting that an ebook will be read by multiple people. So they've multiplied out the cost. And, it just was hugely complicated. I don't know what all the hoops are right now. There were some titles that were embargoed for libraries. Publishers didn't want libraries getting them because it meant that people weren't going to be buying it. So don't get me started. I could talk about that for 3 hours. So Hope, I think you had a question.
No, it wasn't a question. I just wanted to sort of echo Claire and how important libraries are to children growing up.
Yes.
And, I lived just off a very busy street and was not allowed to do much on my own until I was pretty grown up, but I could go to the library because that was important. And I can still remember the smell of it, the look of it. It was such a big part of my childhood.
Yeah. Well, as my colleague Mary certainly knows even better than I, getting kids to read even before they can read, but learning how to hold a book. That is so important, and learning how to turn a page. There were studies done here. You hear about food deserts. Well, there are book deserts here in Philadelphia where there is no place around, even at a drugstore, where they can buy something in paper that they can read. And that was something that the Free Library really has attempted to do a lot. And I think, or they're still doing a lot in terms of getting kids ready to read. So, that whole phrase, reading readiness, being ready to read, was just a huge part of early learning, and what a good public library should and is doing. So yes.
Claire, oh,
I was just gonna add, the other thing that the library taught me was how to research.
Mhm.
With the help of my mother, I got to learn the Dewey Decimal System and how to just go and research the cards to find what I was looking for, which really helped me in my adult. I'm very good internet searcher, but I give credit to the Dewey Decimal System.
Well, you learned a structure, and you learned how to to dig a little deeper. And again,
Yeah.
when I said, I think having access to accurate information that's freely available is especially now in the internet age where, people are sharing God knows what, and some of it's not right, but we know that. So I'm preaching to the choir here.
Yes, tour days.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to comment, Anne, because I think it's extraordinary that, at least in my mind's eye growing up, the fact that there was a building in my community dedicated to books was extraordinary. So I thought maybe you could comment on that, because I think it's sort of like subliminal, but I think it's important.
Yes. And thank you for that. Yes, I mean, it was just like in my dad's small town, that was not a Carnegie library. The Carnegie libraries are, in many parts of the country, and we have several Carnegie libraries here in Philadelphia. But that, that whole history of having something available for everybody, where anybody could go in and could, educate themselves and read about other places. That's been really part of the public library history from the get-go. So thank you for that. And I personally am sorry that our sports teams, I'm not, I get sports teams, but why is it that they get all the funding and the libraries and the school systems are
Yes.
always lagging behind? I don't get it. Because just like you, library was really important to my childhood, and to many, many other people. And it's nice to hear some of you share your stories of when you were growing up.
I was going to say that when my son was interviewed on Fresh Air regarding his first novel, Terry Gross asked him why he became a writer, and he said, because we had books in my home.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I bet you read to your kids just as my parents read to me. It was just what we did. So
Yep.
I was ready to get that library card and was really happy on that day when I was able to get my own card. I think.
Thank you.
Lucy.
Speaking of library cards, I have a little anecdote or confession, I guess. When I was about 12 years old, the Philadelphia Public Libraries at that time, I don't know what the age was, but you had to be a certain age to go take out books from the adult section.
Yep.
I don't mean the adult section. I mean it was the library upstairs was the children's library. Yeah, right. Yeah. And my friend Marcia and I, we were avid readers. And I was going to say that in my family, my father he was on personal first name basis with the librarian at this library. Anyway, I mentioned that for a reason. My friend and I decided we were tired of the limited selection in the children's section. And so we went down to the adult section and ostensibly filled out for new library cards as at whatever age we lied that we were. And I won't mention what name I used, but the point is, in those days, when you got your library card, they mailed it to your house.
Mm-hmm.
And it came to my house, and my father, unfortunately, saw the mail first. And when he saw that, he says, "What is this?" I said, "Well," I explained. He said, "But this is outrageous. You don't do this." He made me go back to the library and speak to Mrs. Agnew, who I've never forgotten to this day, her name, and apologize to her and to volunteer to help out to make kind of recompense for my horrible crime of wanting to take out a regular novel. That's my story, but I came from
Quite some penance.
Yeah, well, there was certainly a protective element at some point, as Mary, I'm sure, can attest to. I had some of that when I was growing up too. I read a lot, and I don't remember what book it was I wanted to read. And my branch librarian, Mrs. O'Brien, because I remember her name too, was like, well, let's see you read this, so so I read it and I could explain what I was reading. So she was like, okay. But I think that's, let's just say, I don't think that happens too often, at least in the free library. I hope it doesn't, because we try to recognize people are at different levels. And, if you don't understand it, is it going to hurt you? Probably not. So you'll read it again, maybe 50 years later, as I know Wynn is on this Zoom call, and I know he's been reading things that, rereading things that he read many, many years ago, and I'm sure he reads it very differently now than when he first read it.
Well, you're reminding me of the many happy hours I spent at Lovett Library when I was a kid. My father had his business in Mount Airy, and I came in the summertime when I was off school, and I would go to Lovett Library, and thank goodness for open stacks, because I just nosed around until I found something. And I read Victorian novels, John Galsworthy, when I was 10 years old. So God bless them. Library.
And we have a personal question.
Yeah.
Since you mentioned the Shenandoah Valley, our daughter lives in Stanton, Virginia.
Mhm.
Is that anywhere close to where you were?
Well, it's south of where we were, so up the valley, as they would say in Virginia, because of the way the river flows. We were just outside of Winchester, Virginia, so in the
Okay.
northern part.
Gotcha. Okay, thank
And on
you.
another piece, in high school, we both grew up in Brooklyn. And in high school, in my senior year, to make a couple of dollars, and I worked in the library during all my breaks. And the library was right around the corner from me. And I can just remember the cards, and the cards went in the pocket in the back of the book. I don't know whether that was every place, but you had to
Yeah.
put the cards under a machine, and then both cards went in the book. And I can just remember myself putting those cards in the pocket when I was in high school and working in the library.
Yeah.
After 55 years, I just learned something new about my wife. I never knew that.
Well, I'm so glad to bring you two together. We're all about connecting people.
Exactly.
Well, this has been lovely. Is any residual questions here? Yes, Steve.
Well, not so much a question, but since Lucy shared an anecdote, I'll share a very short one. Where I taught for a long time at Akiba Hebrew Academy, there was a contest with the mascot of the library, a little bear, a stuffed bear. And the winner, of course, got a shirt that who knows where they got it from. But the contest was to name the bear. And I named the bear the Biblio bear. And I won the shirt.
That's great. Do you still have said shirt?
I do. And so I'll show you sometime. It has nothing to do with any library. It's about supporting Indian youth. I have no idea where they picked it up from.
Great.
Well, thank you, folks. I hope you will join us on May 2nd, when we will interview Claire and have as much fun as we're having tonight.
And thank you for choosing me instead of watching the campaign debate.
We take you any day, Ann.
You can do both because it's starting now.
It starts at 8 o'clock.
8 o'clock.
Oh, I see.
All right.
All right.
Well,
Thank you,
nice to
folks.
see you all. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Great. Thanks, Pam. Thanks,
Thanks to